The attic wasn't what made the veteran stop breathing for a second. It was what his dog found before he even climbed up there. Rain hammered the roof as Frank shoved a blood-stained journal into his backpack. Below him, heavy footsteps echoed through the old cabin, getting closer with every creak of the stairs. Duke suddenly froze, ears locked on a dark corner of the attic, then began scratching at the floorboards with frantic urgency. A cold draft touched Frank's neck. Something hidden was waiting just beneath them, and someone else seemed to know it was there. What do you think Duke sensed first? The rain came sideways across the Idaho Valley, hard and cold enough to turn the dirt road black. Frank Miller stood beside the gate of what used to be his farm with one hand wrapped around the strap of an old canvas duffel and the other resting on Duke's collar. The German shepherd stood close to his knee, gray around the muzzle, ears lifted, eyes fixed on the porch. Caleb Miller stood under that porch light like he owned the whole world. "Uncle Frank," Caleb said, holding the folder against his chest to keep the rain off it. "You signed the transfer. It's legal." Frank looked past him at the farmhouse windows. One upstairs window still had the crack from the winter Duke chased a raccoon off the roof. The porch rail still carried the gouge Frank had made with a saw when his hands shook too badly one morning. The barn behind it leaned a little, but it was standing. 40 years of work could stand in the rain and still be called someone else's. "I thought I was signing the tax extension," Frank said. His voice came out low, flat. Not angry enough to satisfy anybody. Caleb's jaw tightened. He was 32, clean boots, clean truck, clean hands. Hands that had never pulled fence wire in a snowstorm or dug a calf out of frozen mud. Hands that had placed papers in front of an old man and tapped where to sign. You had every chance to read it. Frank nodded once, as if Caleb had just confirmed the weather. Behind him, Duke gave a low sound. Not a bark. More like a warning rolling up from deep in his chest. Caleb glanced at the dog and took half a step back. "You can't stay here tonight," Caleb said. "The buyer's people are coming in the morning. I don't need trouble." Frank looked down at the duffel. 2 shirts, 1 coat, a shaving kit, a dented metal ammo box that had belonged to his father, Duke's leash, and a half-empty bag of dog food. That was what a life looked like when someone else packed it fast. The rain struck the brim of his old cap and ran down the side of his face. Caleb kept talking. Something about legal notice, liability, making things harder than they had to be. Frank watched his mouth move and heard none of it. A truck passed on the county road behind them. Its tires hit a pothole with a hollow metallic bang. Frank's shoulders dropped before he could stop them. For half a second, the porch light became a flare over hard desert ground. The rain became dust. The smell of wet pine turned into burned rubber and hot metal. Somewhere, a young man was yelling for a medic near a broken convoy outside Fallujah. Then Duke pressed his body hard against Frank's leg. Warm, solid, present. Frank lowered his hand to the dog's neck and felt the pulse under thick fur. 1, 2, 3. He breathed with it until the porch came back. Idaho. Rain. Caleb. The farm. Caleb looked uncomfortable now, but not ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said. Frank picked up the duffel. "No, you're not." He turned before Caleb could answer and walked down the drive. Duke stayed tight beside him, not pulling, not lagging. The old dog's paws made soft sounds in the mud. Neither of them looked back when the porch light went out. Frank's pickup waited at the road, a rusted 1994 Ford with a heater that worked when it wanted to, and a passenger door that had to be slammed twice. He lifted the duffel into the bed, then opened the driver's door. Duke climbed in first, stiff in the hips, but stubborn about help. He settled across the passenger seat and stared through the windshield toward the dark line of the fields. Frank sat behind the wheel and shut the door. For a long time, he did not start the engine, The farmhouse disappeared behind sheets of rain. The only light came from the dashboard, weak and green, showing the mileage, the cracked fuel gauge, the old photo tucked into the visor. His wife, Anne, before the cancer. Walter Miller, his father, standing behind her with one hand on the porch post. Frank younger, broader, still wearing a face that thought hard things ended when you came home. Duke shifted and laid his head on Frank's thigh. Frank started the truck. He drove without choosing a direction at first. Past the closed feed store. Past the diner where Anne used to order pie even when she claimed she was full. Past the little veterans hall with the flag snapping in the wind. He avoided Main Street because he knew Caleb might have already told someone. People in small towns heard bad news fast, and they repeated it with pity on their tongues. By midnight, the rain had turned colder. Frank pulled under the old highway overpass outside Grangeville, where the concrete pillars were stained with years of runoff and graffiti faded into gray shadows. He parked where the truck could not be seen easily from the road. Habit. Never silhouette yourself. Keep one exit open. Watch the high ground. There was no high ground here, only concrete and wet gravel and the roar of semis overhead. The truck's heater coughed twice, gave him 10 minutes of lukewarm air, then quit. Frank did not curse. Cursing took energy. He pulled his coat tighter, opened the duffel, and spread one shirt over Duke's back. The dog lifted his head, objecting with his eyes. "Don't start," Frank muttered. "You're older than I am in dog years." Duke huffed and put his head back down. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the overpass in steady ticks. Somewhere in the dark, a bottle rolled in the wind. The smell of wet concrete filled the cab. At 2:17 in the morning, a semi crossed overhead and hit the bridge seam. The sound cracked through the truck like mortar landing close. Frank was moving before thought caught up. His left hand grabbed for a rifle that was not there. His right shoved Duke down below window level. His breath locked in his chest. The dark windshield became night vision green. The overpass became an underpass outside Kandahar. Someone shouted contact left. Duke pushed up hard and forced his head under Frank's hand. Frank's fingers closed in the dog's fur. No rifle. No convoy. No smoke. Just rain. Just an old man in a dead truck with nowhere to go. He sat there until the shaking moved out of his hands and into his jaw. Then he counted breaths because counting was better than remembering. 4 in. Hold. 6 out. Duke watched him the whole time. Near dawn, Frank gave up on sleep. The sky beyond the overpass softened from black to iron gray. His knees ached. His back burned. His stomach had been empty since noon, but Duke still had food, and that mattered more. He reached into the duffel for the dog bowl, and his fingers struck cold metal. The ammo box. Frank pulled it onto his lap. Olive green. Scratched. One corner dented from the year Walter dropped it off the tractor. His father had kept nails in it, then fishing lures, then old papers nobody was allowed to throw away. Frank had not opened it since the funeral. The latch resisted at first. He worked it loose with his thumbnail. Inside were yellowed envelopes, a folded bandana, a compass, and a small roll of oilcloth tied with twine. Something heavy shifted at the bottom. Duke raised his head. Frank untied the oilcloth. A rusted brass key fell into his palm. Beside it was a narrow strip of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was Walter's, slanted, hard-pressed, the kind of writing made by a man who expected paper to argue back. Frank unfolded it slowly. "Go to the Ridge House. Don't trust anyone in town." Frank stared at the words until the rain outside seemed to quiet. Duke stood on the passenger seat, nose pointed toward the key, ears forward. Frank closed his fist around the brass until its teeth bit into his skin. "Ridge House," he whispered. Duke gave one soft bark. Not loud, just enough to sound like an answer. Frank sat under the overpass with the brass key in his palm and the strip of paper laid flat across his knee. Go to the Ridge House. Don't trust anyone in town. The words were simple enough. That was what made them worse. Walter Miller had not been a man who wrote warnings for drama. He wrote things like replace pump belt before first frost or north fence weak near creek. If Walter wrote don't trust anyone, he had already weighed the ground, the weather, the people, and the odds. Frank read the note 3 more times. Duke kept his nose close to the key, breathing in short, careful pulls, the way he did when he found a person under storm debris years ago. Before Frank's hips got bad, before Duke's muzzle went gray, before both of them became too old for official work and too stubborn for retirement. You know something I don't? Frank asked. Duke looked at him, then at the ammo box. Frank reached back inside. Under the folded bandana was a small packet wrapped in wax paper. The paper had gone soft at the edges, stained faintly brown where time had pressed against it. Frank unfolded it with both thumbs. A map lay inside. Not a printed road map. Walter had drawn it by hand in pencil, each ridge line shaded with the patience of a man who knew the mountains by foot, not by survey. There were creek bends, old logging roads, fire breaks, and a string of small X marks trailing north from Idaho into western Montana. Near the upper corner, written in the same hard slanted hand, were 2 words. Bitterroot Line. Frank leaned closer. His eyes were not what they used to be. The dim morning light under the overpass made the pencil marks swim. He took off his cap, wiped rainwater from the windshield with his sleeve, and held the map higher. At the end of a narrow road drawn like a vein into the mountains, Walter had marked a square. Ridge House. Frank stared at it. He had never been there. Not that he remembered. Walter used to disappear into the mountains sometimes when Frank was young. 3 days, 4 days, once nearly 2 weeks. He would come back with mud on the truck, pine pitch on his sleeves, and a silence around him the rest of the family knew not to disturb. Frank's mother used to say, "Your father goes where the radio can't follow." Frank had thought it meant hunting, or solitude, or grief left over from whatever men of Walter's generation did not name. Now, looking at the map, he wasn't so sure. Duke nudged the ammo box again. "All right," Frank said. "Hold your horses." He lifted out the last thing in the box. It was an old black and white photograph inside a cracked plastic sleeve. Walter stood in front of a small log structure, half hidden by pines. He was younger than Frank remembered him best, maybe in his 40s, wearing a wool jacket and holding a hammer in one hand. Behind him, the cabin had a steep roof and narrow upstairs windows, tucked against a ridge of rock. On the back, someone had written only the year. Frank turned it over again. Walter's face was not smiling, exactly, but there was something in his eyes. Purpose. Secrecy. A man standing beside something he had built and hoping no one asked the wrong question. Duke sniffed the photo once, then twice, his ear tilted forward. Then he did something strange. He lifted one paw and scratched gently at the plastic sleeve. "Easy," Frank said. "That's all I got of him." Duke did not stop. He scratched again, not hard enough to tear, but deliberate. Frank frowned and slid the photograph out of the sleeve. The plastic backing was thicker than it needed to be. When he pressed his thumbnail along the edge, the seam opened with a faint crackle. A smaller strip of paper slid out and landed on the seat. Frank picked it up. Safe House 3. The cab went still. A pickup passed overhead, and the bridge seam hit with a boom that traveled through the concrete and into Frank's ribs. This time he closed his eyes before the old world could fully rise. 4 in, hold, 6 out. Duke put his chin on Frank's wrist. Frank opened his eyes. Safe House 3. He thought of Walter's careful hands, the old man repairing roof shingles in silence, teaching Frank how to sharpen an axe, showing him how to read animal tracks in snow, then later, when Frank came back from his first deployment, showing him how to sleep with his back to two walls without making it sound like advice. Walter had known things. He just had never said all of them out loud. Frank looked at the fuel gauge, almost empty. He checked his wallet. $38 in cash. One debit card that probably had less than that. No house, no land, no town he could trust if the note was right. Duke's food bag was half full. That helped make the decision. Frank started the truck and let the engine rattle awake. The heater blew cold air, then a weak breath of warmth. Above them, traffic rolled east and west, people going to work, to breakfast, to homes that still belonged to them. He pulled out from under the overpass just after sunrise. The first gas station he passed was still closed. The second had two pumps, one flickering light, and a clerk inside drinking coffee from a paper cup. Frank parked where he could see the road and the front door. Old habit. He fed the truck $20 of gas, then bought a small black coffee, a packet of crackers, and a can of wet dog food for Duke. The clerk glanced at the German Shepherd through the window. "Good-looking dog," he said. Frank nodded. "He working?" Frank paused with his hand on the counter. "Working," as if Duke had ever stopped. "He watches," Frank said. The clerk gave a polite laugh, but Frank was already looking past him. Across the road, near the old tire shop, a black SUV idled beside the curb. Tinted windows, clean body, out-of-county plates. Frank had seen it once the previous afternoon near Caleb's driveway, or thought he had. Maybe his mind had been busy building threats out of shadows. The SUV did not move. Frank took his change and walked out slowly. Not hurried. Hurrying told people you had something worth chasing. He opened the passenger door, let Duke climb in, then stood a second longer than needed, using the window reflection to watch the road. The SU-5 pulled away before he did. Frank got in and closed the door. Duke stared through the windshield, body still, ears locked forward. "Yeah," Frank murmured. "I saw it." He did not follow the main highway north. Instead, he drove west for 6 miles, turned down a farm road, crossed a narrow bridge, and doubled back through a gravel service route he remembered from hauling hay 20 years earlier. Twice he slowed near intersections. Twice he watched the mirror until only rain haze and empty road sat behind him. By mid-morning, the sky cleared into a hard pale blue. The land rose gradually, fields giving way to timber, timber thickening into dark stretches of pine and fir. Frank drove with the map on the seat beside him, and Duke's head resting close to it, as if the dog were guarding the paper from the world. Near the Montana line, Frank pulled off beside a creek to let the engine cool. His hands ached when he opened them. The brass key had left a row of small red marks in his palm. He crouched by the water and filled an old bottle for washing. Duke limped down to the creek, drank, then lifted his head toward the north. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked. Frank went still. No birds scattered. No engine. No voices. Only the creek, Duke's breathing, and a memory trying to crawl up from the dark. A night outside Mosul. Broken culvert. Road too quiet. A young lieutenant saying the route looked clear. Frank had put one hand up then, palm closed. Hold. The convoy had stopped. 30 seconds later, the road ahead disappeared in orange light. Back beside the creek, Frank felt his fingers curl the same way. Hold. Duke did not move. After a full minute, a mule deer stepped from the trees, looked at them, and bounded away through the brush. Frank let the breath leave his chest. "Clear," he said softly. Duke glanced back at him, almost offended. Frank managed something close to a smile. They kept driving. The roads got smaller after that. Pavement turned to cracked pavement, then gravel, then a narrow logging track with grass growing between the ruts. Pines crowded close enough to scrape the sides of the truck. The map became harder to match to the ground, but Walter's marks were good. Better than good. Every creek bend was where he said it would be. Every split in the road. Every old fire scar. Near dusk, Frank reached the last mark before the ridge house. A fallen sign lay half buried in weeds beside the road. The letters were almost gone, but he could still make out the shape of them under moss and rust. County Access Road 9. Frank shut off the engine. The silence came down around the truck, deep and watchful. Duke stood on the passenger seat, staring through the windshield. Frank looked at the map. Beyond Road 9, Walter had drawn no more lines. Just the little square, the words Ridge House, and a final note written so small Frank had to hold it near the last light. If the road is blocked, walk the creek. Frank lifted his eyes toward the dark tunnel of trees ahead. The truck had maybe 15 miles of gas left. Duke gave one low sound in his throat. Frank reached for the brass key. "All right," he said. "Let's go see what you left me, Dad." Road 9 did not look like a road anymore. It was a narrow wound through the pines, half swallowed by grass and old needles, with ruts deep enough to hold rainwater in black strips. Frank eased the truck forward in low gear, both hands steady on the wheel. Branches scraped along the doors with a dry, fingernail sound. Duke stood braced on the passenger seat, front paws planted wide, nose close to the cracked window. The farther they climbed, the less the world sounded like people. No highway hum, no cattle, no distant machinery, just the slow groan of timber in the wind and the soft knock of stones under the tires. Frank watched everything. The slope to the left, the drop to the right, the places where a truck could turn around, the places where it could not. Twice he stopped, stepped out into the wet road, and studied the mud behind him. No fresh tire marks. Not yet. By the second mile, fog began to gather between the trees. It came low and white, curling around the trunks like breath from something sleeping under the mountain. Frank clicked off the headlights and switched to the dim parking lights. He had no reason to make himself easy to find. Duke looked at him. "I know," Frank said. "Old habits." A mile later, the road forked. Walter's map showed only one line, but time had split the ground into choices. The left fork climbed sharply under leaning fir trees. The right dipped toward the sound of running water. Frank shut off the engine. Silence folded over the truck. He took the map from the seat and angled it toward the pale light. Walter's pencil line crossed a creek before rising again. Frank listened. Water on the right. He tucked the map into his coat and eased the truck down that way. The road worsened almost immediately. Mud slapped the undercarriage. The truck slid once, just a little, and Frank's right hand moved before thought, correcting the drift with the same calm he used to guide supply trucks along roads where every pile of trash might be more than trash. Duke's nails clicked against the vinyl seat. "You and me both," Frank muttered. At the creek crossing, the old wooden bridge was gone. Only two moss-covered beams remained, broken in the middle, hanging over the water like ribs. The creek below ran fast over stone, swollen from rain. On the far bank, the road continued into the timber. Frank sat with the engine idling. If the road is blocked, walk the creek. His father had known. Frank turned off the truck and leaned back. His knees complained before he even moved. His back had stiffened from the cold. Every part of him said to stay in the cab, lock the doors, wait for morning, pretend the map had brought him far enough. Duke climbed down before he did. The old German shepherd landed in the mud with a grunt, shook once, then stood facing the creek. Frank opened the door. "All right, Sergeant. I'm coming." He took only what mattered. The map, the brass key, a flashlight, a folding knife, one bottle of water. The old ammo box, now lighter but somehow more important than before. He tied the duffel tight and slung it across his shoulder. Duke moved ahead along the creek bank, slow but sure, nose down, choosing the higher ground where the mud held less water. Frank followed, placing his boots where the dog did when he could. The sky darkened early under the trees. Fog thickened. The creek kept them oriented, its sound pulling them forward when the trail vanished under fern and deadfall. Frank counted distance in steps, then stopped counting when his ankle began to throb. Once a raven called somewhere overhead. Frank froze. The sound cracked open a memory. A radio squawk in Helmand. A bird's cry mixed with rotor wash. A young soldier laughing too loudly at a bad joke because everyone knew the road ahead was wrong. Frank pressed his palm flat against a pine trunk until the bark bit his skin. Duke circled back and leaned against his thigh. Frank looked down. The dog's eyes were steady. Not worried. Not impatient. Just there. "Moving," Frank whispered. He stepped on. Near dusk, the creek bent hard around a shoulder of stone, and Duke stopped. Not paused. Stopped. His ears lifted. His body went still, pointed uphill toward a dark gap in the timber. Frank crouched automatically. He scanned the ground first. Broken twigs, old deer tracks, no boot prints that he could see, no cigarette butts, no tire grooves. He listened. Wind, water, trees. Then he saw it. A roofline. At first, it looked like another ridge shadow, a dark triangle tucked into the pines above them. Then the fog shifted, and the shape became wood. A steep roof. Narrow upper windows. One corner sagging under years of snow. The safe house. Frank did not move for a long moment. The photograph had made it feel small, forgotten, almost harmless. In front of him, the place seemed to be waiting. The cabin sat against a shoulder of rock, half hidden by fir trees and wild brush. The porch leaned to one side. The front steps were gray with rot. Moss climbed the lower logs. A rusted chimney rose from the roof like an old rifle barrel pointed at the sky. No smoke, no light. But the clearing around it was not as wild as it should have been. Frank noticed that before he noticed anything else. A branch near the path had been cut, not broken. Fresh sap still showed pale on the wound. Ferns beside the porch were bent in a line wide enough for a man's legs. Near the far side of the clearing, a boot had scuffed the mud and exposed lighter soil underneath. Frank's hand closed around Duke's collar. The dog did not growl. He watched the cabin with a stillness that made Frank's skin tighten. Someone had been here. Maybe days ago. Maybe hours. Frank moved left, keeping the trees between himself and the front door. He did not walk straight across the clearing. Straight lines got men hurt. He circled wide, stopped behind a cedar, waited, moved again. Duke followed without a sound. At the side of the cabin, Frank crouched below a window and listened. Nothing inside. Not even mice. He stood slowly and looked through the dusty glass. A dim room, covered furniture, a table, a stone fireplace. No movement. The brass key felt heavy in his pocket. He came around to the porch from the side, testing each board before putting weight on it. One step gave under his heel with a wet crack. Frank shifted off it and waited for the sound to settle. Duke stayed at the bottom of the steps. Frank looked back. "Come on." Duke did not move. His head was tilted upward, nose pointed toward the second floor. Frank followed his line of sight. One of the upstairs windows was slightly open. Only an inch. Enough. Frank's mouth went dry. The air had turned colder. Fog slid across the porch boards. Somewhere behind the house, water dripped from the roof in slow, steady taps. Frank pulled the flashlight from his coat, but did not turn it on yet. With his other hand, he drew the brass key and slid it into the front lock. For a second, nothing happened. Then the key turned. The deadbolt gave with a low metallic click that seemed much too loud in the mountain quiet. Duke came up the steps then. Not before. Only after the lock opened. Frank pushed the door inward. The smell came out first. Dust, old pine, cold ashes, a faint animal musk from years of something nesting where people no longer lived. He clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam low across the floor. The room opened in pale strips of light. Canvas-covered chairs, a table with one leg slightly crooked, a row of shelves, a black wood stove near the far wall. Then Frank saw the dust. It lay thick across the floorboards, gray and undisturbed in most places. Most places. From the front door, cutting straight through the living room toward the back hall, was a line of footprints, large, deep, fresh. The tread pattern was sharp enough to read. Frank did not step inside. He moved to the side of the doorway, shoulder against the log wall, flashlight angled down. Duke lowered himself beside him, body close to the floor, ears forward. The old dog's lips lifted just enough to show teeth. Frank looked at the prints, then toward the dark hallway where they disappeared. His father had sent him to a safe house, but someone else had found it first. Frank stayed outside the doorway for a long moment, letting the house speak before he stepped into it. Old wood cracked softly. Water tapped somewhere in the kitchen. Wind pressed against the upper window and made it whisper in its frame. Nothing moved across the living room except the thin beam of his flashlight and the dust floating through it. Duke's shoulder brushed his knee. Frank kept one hand on the dog's collar and angled the flashlight toward the footprints again. Large boot. Lug sole. Deep heel. A working boot, not a hunter's soft tread. Whoever came through here had weight on him and did not care much about being quiet. That meant confidence. Or anger. Frank set his own boot down beside the first print without touching it. Different size. Different pattern. He had spent enough years reading dirt, sand, ash, and boot marks to know the story was fresh. The edges of the prints were sharp. The dust pushed aside in ridges, not settled back soft. No spiderwebs crossed them. Recent, he whispered. Duke's ears flicked once. Frank stepped inside, not down the middle of the room, but along the wall where the floorboards looked strongest. He kept his shoulders turned, never putting his full body in the dark hallway ahead. The flashlight stayed low. Men had a habit of aiming at light. The living room felt untouched in the way abandoned rooms do. A canvas sheet still covered the couch. A cracked coffee mug sat on the mantel, turned upside down. A stack of firewood rested beside the black stove, gray with dust but neatly split. Walter had stacked wood that way. Frank's throat tightened around the thought, but he did not give it room. The footprints cut straight past the living room and into the back hall. Duke moved ahead now, low and controlled. Not hunting, clearing. His old training lived in his bones, same as Frank's. Stop at corners. Smell before seeing. Wait for the hand signal even when the man giving it had nothing left but a pocket knife and old instincts. At the hallway entrance, Frank held up 2 fingers. Duke stopped. Frank leaned just enough to sweep the beam across the hall. 3 doors. One to the kitchen. One to a narrow washroom. One at the end, partly open. The prince went to the last door. Frank clicked the flashlight off. Darkness fell hard. He waited until his eyes adjusted to the gray light coming from the front room, then moved forward by memory and shape. The floor creaked under his left foot. He froze. No answer from the house. No breath. No shift. No scrape of another man trying not to move. He reached the open door and touched it with 2 fingers. The room beyond smelled of paper and mouse droppings. He pushed the door slowly. The hinges gave a thin, tired cry. Duke's growl came again, barely there. Frank clicked the flashlight on and swept it fast across the room. Clear. The study had been torn apart. A heavy oak desk sat under the window, its drawers pulled out and dumped. Papers lay scattered across the floor. Yellowed utility bills, old envelopes, county notices, notebooks with curled covers. One shelf had been yanked half off the wall. The canvas sheet that must have covered the desk had been thrown into a corner like a dead animal. Frank stood in the doorway, taking it in. The family photographs still hung on the wall. Walter in a fishing hat beside a young Frank holding up a trout too small to brag about. Frank's mother standing beside a woodpile with a hand over her eyes. Anne on the porch years later, smiling at Duke when he was still young enough to jump without thinking about it. The intruder had not taken them. He had not come for memories. Frank crossed the study and crouched near the desk. The dust around the drawers showed fast movement. Rough hands, papers scattered but not examined long. Someone had been looking for one thing and losing patience. On the floor near the desk leg was a smear of dark mud. Frank touched the edge of it with the back of his fingernail. Still damp. His stomach went quiet. Duke suddenly turned his head toward the ceiling. Frank followed the movement. Nothing above but old beams and shadow. A boom of thunder rolled over the ridge. The whole house shook with it. Frank dropped to the floor before he knew he had moved. His shoulder hit the boards. His hand went over his head. His mouth filled with dust, and the study disappeared. A blast wave. White light. Gravel raining against the side of an armored truck. A man named Ruiz trying to say something through blood and sand. Frank's own hands pressing down, pressing harder, trying to keep what was leaving from leaving. Then warmth touched his wrist. Duke. The dog had lowered himself beside Frank, licking once, then pressing his nose under Frank's palm. Not frantic, not afraid, just there, bringing him back the way he had done under the overpass. Frank swallowed. His fingers found Duke's fur. The thunder moved away. The study returned. Dust, papers, broken shelf, Idaho behind him, Montana ahead, not Afghanistan, not that road, not that day. Frank pushed himself up slowly. Good boy, he breathed. Duke blinked, then turned his head back toward the hall. Work first, comfort later. Frank wiped dust from his cheek and stood. His ribs ached where he had hit the floor, but the ache was useful. It belonged to now. The footprints left the study and returned to the hall. Frank followed them. They did not go into the kitchen. They did not stop in the washroom. They continued to the stairs. The staircase rose steeply along the back wall, narrow and dark. A thin strip of light came from the open upstairs window Duke had spotted outside. The boot prints climbed the steps, each one stamped through the dust. Frank stood at the bottom and listened. The upper floor gave back nothing. He took the stairs slow, keeping to the edges where old boards complained less. Duke stayed one step below him until the landing, then slid ahead without waiting. Frank almost called him back, but the dog had already stopped at the top. Body turned sideways, giving Frank room. Clear. The second floor was smaller than it had looked from outside. One bedroom. One little room with stacked crates. A short hall under the slope of the roof. Cold air drifted from the cracked open window, carrying the smell of wet pine. The boot prints had gone into the bedroom first. Frank entered low. An iron bed frame stood against the wall, mattress long gone. A washstand with a cracked mirror sat near the window. The closet door stood open. Inside the closet, old coats hung from wooden pegs. A cardboard box had been shoved aside. Dust showed where someone had stepped in, turned, stepped out. Frank raised the flashlight. Nothing. The intruder had searched like a man who knew there was something to find, but did not know where. That was dangerous. Frank backed out and followed the prints again. They crossed the upstairs hall, circled once near the crates, then returned toward the stairs. At the top step, the footprints overlapped, in and out. The intruder had left the same way he came. Frank let out a breath he had not meant to hold. Then Duke made a sound. Not a growl, not a bark, a soft, tight whine. Frank turned. The dog stood in the hallway beneath the sloping ceiling, staring upward at a strip of old tongue and groove boards above the bedroom door. His nose lifted. His ears locked. His front paws shifted once, restless. "Duke," Frank whispered. Duke did not look at him. Frank followed the angle of the dog's nose. The ceiling looked ordinary. Old wood, water stains, a dead moth caught in a cobweb. Nothing more. But the air there was different. Frank stepped under it and felt the faintest thread of cold brush his cheek. A draft. From above. Duke lifted one paw and tapped the wall below the ceiling. Once. Twice. Frank looked back down the stairs, then at the boot prints, then at the ceiling again. The man who had come first had searched the desk, the bedroom, the closet, the crates. But he had missed what Duke had found in less than a minute. Frank reached up and pressed his fingers against the old boards. One of them shifted. Just a hair. A thin line of darkness showed between the seams. Frank stood still with his hand on the ceiling, the house breathing cold air against his knuckles. Somewhere inside the wall above him, something wooden creaked. Duke stepped closer, eyes fixed upward. Frank thought of Walter's note. Go to the Ridge House. Don't trust anyone in town. And now, above his head, the safe house had begun to answer. Frank kept his palm against the ceiling board and felt the cold draft slip between his fingers. It was not much. Just a thin breath of air from somewhere above the old hallway, steady enough to raise the hair along his wrist. A house sealed for years should not breathe like that, not from inside its bones. Duke stood under it, nose lifted, eyes bright in the gray light. Frank whispered, "Back." The dog took one step away, then sat. He did not take his eyes off the boards. Frank looked around the upstairs hall. No ladder, no hatch, no pull cord hanging from the ceiling. Whoever built this had not meant it to be found by someone walking through in a hurry. He went back down to the study and returned with a straight-backed chair, one of the few pieces of furniture the intruder had not overturned. The chair creaked under his weight before he even climbed it. "Don't you say it," Frank muttered. Duke's ears twitched. Frank placed one boot on the seat, then the other. His knees burned. His right hip gave a sharp complaint, and for a second he had to steady himself against the wall. The old house seemed to lean around him. He pressed both hands against the loose board and pushed. Nothing. He shifted his weight and tried again. The board rose a quarter inch, then stuck. Frank pulled his folding knife from his pocket and worked the blade into the seam. Dust fell into his face. He coughed once, quiet and dry, then paused to listen. No sound outside. No truck. No voices. Only Duke breathing below him. Frank pried again. The board lifted with a slow wooden groan. Behind it, a narrow black gap appeared, no wider than his hand. Cold air moved through it and carried the smell of cedar, old paper, and something metallic. He slid the board sideways. A hidden latch sat recessed in the beam. Frank stared at it. Walter. He reached up, hooked 2 fingers into the latch, and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then somewhere inside the ceiling, a spring released. A section of wood dropped 6 inches with a heavy clack. The sound punched through the hallway. Frank froze on the chair. The clack became another sound. A rifle bolt in the dark. A door kicked open. Metal on metal. Men breathing too fast before contact. His hands locked on the ceiling panel. Duke moved instantly. The dog put both front paws against the chair, not jumping, not panicking, just anchoring his weight there so the old chair stopped shaking beneath Frank's boots. Frank looked down. Duke's amber eyes held him. Not there. Here. Frank forced air through his nose. 4 in. Hold. 6 out. The hallway returned. The panel hung above him, and folded against it was a narrow wooden ladder, old but well made, built into the ceiling like a secret that had waited patiently for decades. Frank lowered it by hand. Each rung came down with a soft thud until the ladder touched the floor. Duke stepped back and gave it room. Frank climbed down from the chair, took the flashlight from his coat, and looked up through the opening. Darkness. The air above was colder than the hallway, but dry. That mattered. Dry meant preserved. Dry meant Walter had known what he was doing. Frank put one boot on the first rung. The ladder held. Duke pushed forward, placing a paw on the bottom rung. "No," Frank whispered. "I clear it first." Duke looked up at him as if the order were unreasonable, but he stayed. Frank climbed. Halfway up, the house groaned under a gust of wind. The flashlight beam trembled across old joists and cobwebs. Frank paused, shoulder tight against the frame, listening for movement above. Nothing. He pulled himself into the attic. The space was larger than he expected, running the length of the cabin under the steep roof. The floor was made of rough plywood, dusty but solid. Cedar beams crossed overhead. The only light came from Frank's flashlight and thin silver lines leaking through cracks in the roof. He swept the beam left. Empty crates, rolled canvas, a coil of rope stiff with age. He swept right. The flashlight caught dull green metal. Frank stopped. Against the far wall, bolted into the framing, sat a military footlocker, not the cheap kind sold at surplus stores. This was heavy steel, old olive drab, with reinforced corners and a hasp block blackened by time. Beside it, on the floorboards, was a dark stain. Frank moved closer and crouched. Not oil, not water. The stain had soaked into the wood years ago, maybe decades. Dark brown at the center, faded at the edges. Blood had a way of staying in wood. Duke whined from below. Frank turned toward the opening. The dog stood at the bottom of the ladder, muscles tight, waiting for permission he did not want to need. "Come on," Frank said softly. Duke climbed slowly, one paw, then the next. His hips gave him trouble near the top, and Frank reached down to help. The dog accepted it only because the space was narrow and the job mattered. Once in the attic, Duke moved past Frank and went straight to the stain. He sniffed it once, then lifted his head toward the footlocker. Frank touched the lock. Locked. He tried the brass key from his pocket. Too small. He looked over the footlocker, searching for marks. Walter had always marked things in ways other people missed. A notch in fence wire. A nail bent at a gatepost. A pebble stack near a trail. There, under the left corner of the locker, scratched lightly into the paint, were 3 letters. W.M.M. Walter. Matthew Miller. Frank's father. His chest tightened, but he kept moving. He checked the floor around the locker. then the beams above it. Nothing. Duke had moved toward the sloped wall now. He sniffed along the baseboards, then stopped at a section where the cedar planks seemed ordinary, except for one faint line running vertical between them. He raised his paw and tapped the wall. Once. Frank looked over. You found the door. Now you want another one? Duke tapped again. Frank stood and stepped closer. The plank line was too straight. Not natural shrinkage. Not age. He pressed it with his thumb. Solid. He ran his fingers along the seam and felt a small, round depression hidden under dust. No bigger than a dime. He pushed. Nothing moved. Then he noticed the old phrase Walter had used on the note in the ammo box. Safe House 3. His father built things in threes. 3 nails in a brace. 3 wraps around a tie-down. 3 knocks before opening a storm shelter so people inside knew it was him. Frank pressed the depression 3 times. Once. Twice. 3. A latch clicked behind the wall. Duke stood. The plank shifted outward half an inch. Frank gripped the edge and pulled. A narrow compartment opened, just wide enough to hold a coffee can and a folded square of canvas. The coffee can was rusted around the rim, but the lid still held. Frank took it out with both hands and sat back on his heels. For a second, he did not open it. Outside, wind moved across the roof, carrying the smell of rain and pine. Below them, the old safe house settled on its stones like something listening. Duke lowered himself beside Frank, close enough that their shoulders touched. Frank pried the lid loose. Inside was a small leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. His father's handwriting covered the first page. If Frank is the one reading this, then the ridge has held long enough. Frank stared at the line. Then, from somewhere below the house came a faint sound. Not wind, not wood. A small scrape, like a boot shifting on the porch. Duke's head snapped toward the attic opening. Frank closed the journal slowly and turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed the attic whole. Frank stayed on one knee with the leather journal pressed flat against his chest. Duke stood beside him, body angled toward the open hatch, ears forward, tail still. The old dog did not growl this time. That told Frank more than a bark would have. Whatever made the sound below was close enough to hear, but not close enough yet. Frank slid one hand along the floor until he found the rusted coffee can lid. He set it down without a sound. Then he leaned toward Duke, close enough that his breath barely moved the fur near the dog's ear. Hold. Duke froze. Below them, the house gave another small creak. Then nothing. Frank waited. He counted to 30 in his head, the way he had counted before crossing roads in places where empty windows did not mean empty rooms. At 21, wind brushed the upper wall. At 28, a loose shutter knocked once downstairs. At 30, Duke's shoulders eased just a fraction. Frank reached for the flashlight, but did not switch it on. He crawled to the attic hatch and lowered his head near the opening. The hallway below was dark, gray only where the upstairs window let in a thin wash of evening light. No shape moved. No boot waited at the ladder. No breath broke the quiet. A branch scraped the porch roof outside. Frank let air out through his nose. The house was old. Old houses talked. Still, he did not trust it. He eased back from the hatch, pulled the ladder up halfway, and wedged a broken crate against it. It would not stop a man, but it would complain if one came climbing. Only then did he turn the flashlight back on, covering most of the lens with his fingers so the beam came out dim and red through his skin. Duke returned to the locked military footlocker. Frank set the journal on the floor and opened it. Walter's handwriting filled the pages, tighter near the beginning, shakier toward the end. No long speeches, no poetry. Just dates, weather, observations, and facts laid down like fence posts. November 3rd, 1976. County road washed out again. Took 3 hours to clear enough for the truck. If this place is going to serve, it needs a secondary path. January 18th, 1977. 3 skiers stranded near Cedar Cut. Sheriff couldn't get past the lower bridge. Brought them here before dark. Stove drew well. Pantry needs restocking. April 9th, 1978. House breathes through the upper wall. Good airflow. Dry attic. Best place to hold papers if the lower rooms flood. Frank paused at that line. House breathes. He looked toward the sloped wall where Duke had found the compartment. Walter had not hidden things randomly. He had built a system. Frank turned more pages. September 2nd, 1980. Landslide took Miller Creek Road. 2 families sheltered here overnight. Mrs. Harlan broke her wrist. Radio battery held. December 14th, 1983. Told Frank nothing. Better that way until he has need of it. Frank's thumb stopped. He stared at his own name. The attic seemed to shrink around him, the roof beams pressing low. Duke shifted closer, leaning his shoulder into Frank's arm. Frank kept reading. The later entries changed. Not at first in words, but in pressure. Walter's pen cut deeper into the paper. The lines sat crooked. Names began to appear. Raymond Cole, county attorney then. Smooth as river ice. Asked too many questions about upper water rights. Bitterroot extraction group. Not mining, no matter what they call it. Water. They want the underground reservoir. Always have. Frank turned the page. Caleb came by with coal. Boy was only 15, but watched every drawer I opened. Not his fault yet. But I know hunger when I see it, even in a child with clean shoes. Frank's jaw tightened. Caleb at 15, standing in Walter's kitchen, watching, learning what things might be worth before learning what they meant. Duke lowered his head, nose near the page, as if the name itself had a smell. Frank read on. The ridge line and the lower farm are tied together through access. Miller Land controls the old approach. Whoever owns both can reach the water without crossing federal ground. Cole knows. I denied him once. He will wait for someone weaker. The word weaker sat on the page like a blade left on a table. Frank closed his eyes for a moment. He saw Caleb on the porch in the rain, holding the folder against his chest. You signed the transfer. It's legal. Not theft with a gun. Theft with a pen. Frank opened his eyes. Near the final pages, Walter's writing had gone uneven. If Frank comes back broken, and I know the world may break him, this place is for him. Not for money. Not for pride. For standing ground when men with clean hands tell him he has none. Frank did not move. The attic blurred, then sharpened again. He ran one thumb over the edge of the paper, careful not to smear anything, though the ink had dried decades ago. A man could go a whole life thinking his father had been silent because he had nothing to say. Sometimes silence was only another kind of storage. Duke suddenly sneezed. A hard, sharp sound. Frank looked up. The dog had moved toward the footlocker again, but his nose was angled above it now, toward the ceiling beam. Dust sifted down in a thin line from between 2 planks. Frank frowned. Another sneeze. Then Duke reached back and caught Frank's sleeve gently in his teeth. Not panic. Insistence. Frank followed the dog's pull, shifting his weight back from the footlocker. Easy, he whispered. Duke tugged once harder. A crack split the air. Frank saw the beam above the footlocker bow. He moved without thinking, rolling away as a rotten section of ceiling plank tore loose and crashed down exactly where he had been crouched. Dust exploded through the attic. Wood splinters bounced across the plywood floor. The footlocker rang like a bell under the impact. Frank landed on his bad shoulder and bit down a sound. Duke stood over him, coughing in the dust, eyes fixed on the broken ceiling. For several seconds, Frank could hear nothing but the blood in his ears. Then the dust settled enough for his flashlight beam to cut through. If Duke had not pulled him back, the plank would have struck the base of his skull. Frank sat up slowly. Duke's eyes met his. Frank put a hand to the dog's chest, feeling the steady thud beneath his palm. "Good catch," he said. Duke blinked once, then turned toward the wreckage as if praise were secondary. Behind the fallen plank, the attic wall had changed. What had looked like solid cedar now showed a second surface beyond it, set back a few inches. Not roof, not insulation. A flat, vertical panel, dark with age, hidden behind the outer boards. Frank got to his knees despite the pain in his shoulder. The broken ceiling had exposed the edge of a false wall. Duke stepped over the debris, careful but eager, and sniffed along the new gap. His nose found something, and his tail gave one slow, stiff movement. Frank reached into the opening and brushed dust away. A metal pull ring sat there, recessed into the hidden panel. He stared at it. The military footlocker had been a decoy, or maybe only the first lock in a longer chain. The intruder had missed the hatch. Frank might have missed the wall. Duke had not. Frank wrapped his fingers around the ring. Before he pulled, he looked once more at the journal lying open on the floor. For standing ground, when men with clean hands tell him he has none. Below the attic, the old house creaked again under the wind, or under something else moving through it. Frank tightened his grip on the ring. "All right, Dad," he whispered. "I'm standing." Then he pulled. The hidden panel opened with a low wooden sigh. For a few seconds, Frank did not look inside. He stood there in the attic dust with one hand on the metal ring and the other pressed against the sore place in his shoulder, listening to the old panel settle on its hinges. Duke moved first. He stepped close to the opening and pushed his nose into the dark space beyond it. The dog inhaled once, then sneezed softly. Frank almost smiled. "Still got standards, huh?" Duke glanced back, then returned to the compartment. Frank raised the flashlight. Behind the false wall was not a room. It was a narrow storage cavity built between the roofline and the outer logs, just deep enough to hide what Walter had wanted hidden. No gold, no rifle, no stack of money waiting like some movie miracle. Only a long metal document box wrapped in oilcloth, 2 rolled maps tied with faded string, and a flat wooden case with brass corners. Frank reached in and pulled the metal box out first. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the attic floor, brushed away dust, and found a small latch. No lock. Walter had trusted the wall more than a key. Inside, everything had been packed tight and dry. Deeds, survey plats, water rights filings, easement records, old correspondence with county offices, state land departments, and federal forest supervisors. Each folder labeled in Walter's hand. Miller Creek access, Upper Ridge Spring, subsurface reservoir notes, emergency shelter use, Bitterroot extraction group. Frank stared at that last folder longer than the others. Duke lowered himself beside him with a grunt, close enough that his side pressed against Frank's knee. The old dog was breathing harder now from the climb and the dust, but his eyes remained alert. Frank opened the first map. It showed the mountain around them, not as a tourist would see it, but as a man would see it if he had walked every slope in rain, snow, and smoke. Old logging grades, creek beds, rock shelves, springs, sink points. A deep blue pencil line ran beneath the ridge and widened into a shaded oval under the upper basin. Reservoir, Walter had written. Natural, fed by limestone, holds in drought. Frank unfolded the second map with slower hands. This one showed property lines. His farm in Idaho was marked at the lower edge. Walter's ridge land sat above it. Between them ran a narrow access corridor, little more than an old right-of-way, but legally recorded. The corridor crossed Miller Land, then reached the ridge, then the spring basin. Whoever owned the farm controlled the practical approach. Whoever controlled the ridge controlled the water. Frank sat back on his heels. The room seemed to tilt, not from dizziness, but from understanding arriving too fast. Caleb had not stolen a failing farm. He had taken a gate. Frank opened the folder marked Bitterroot Extraction Group. Inside were letters from years earlier, some typed, some handwritten. Offers to lease water access. Requests for geological inspection. Notices phrased politely enough to hide teeth. Several bore the signature of Raymond Cole. At first, Raymond had signed as county attorney. Later, as private counsel. Later still, as representative for a development partnership with no clear owners. Frank flipped page after page. The dates ran across decades. Walter had refused them all. A note paper-clipped to one letter was written in blue ink. They will wait for me to die. Then they will look for Frank. If he is tired enough, they will dress theft as help. Frank stopped reading. Below the attic, the house remained quiet. Outside, evening pressed darker against the cracks in the roof. Frank could hear the creak faintly below the ridge, still moving through stone the way it had moved long before any man drew lines on paper. Duke shifted beside him. Frank looked down. There was blood on the floor. Not the old stain by the footlocker. Fresh drops, small and bright, near Duke's front paw. Frank's chest tightened. Duke. The dog tried to pull the paw back, as if embarrassment applied to animals. Frank caught it gently. A splinter from the collapsed ceiling had sliced the pad just behind the toes. Not deep enough to cripple, but enough to bleed every time Duke put weight on it. Enough to hurt. Duke had pulled him out from under falling wood and never made a sound. Frank took off his overshirt, tore a clean strip from the hem, and wrapped the paw with careful fingers. He tied it snug, not tight, checking the toes the way he had checked fingers under field dressings in dust and heat. Duke watched him, patient but unhappy. You saved my skull, Frank said. You can tolerate a bandage. The dog huffed through his nose. Frank kept one hand around the wrapped paw for an extra second. His mind did what it always did when blood touched cloth. A flash of a young hand, sand under fingernails. Ruiz again, face pale under a helmet strap, whispering something about his mother's kitchen in El Paso. Frank pressing down with both palms, saying, "Stay with me, though." Both of them knew the body did not always obey orders. Frank blinked hard. The attic returned. Duke's paw in his hand. Warm. Living. This time the bleeding had slowed. Frank let go only after he was sure. He opened the flat wooden case next. Inside was a stack of brittle photographs and a cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. The label on the tape was written in Walter's hand. For Frank, if they come at night. Frank stared at it. The attic seemed colder. He turned the cassette over. No date. No explanation. Just the warning. Duke lifted his head toward the attic hatch. Frank followed the dog's gaze. No sound came from below now, but the earlier scrape returned to him with new weight. Whoever had searched this house had not found the hidden compartment. But they might come back. Walter had expected that too. Frank gathered the documents into the metal box and wrapped it again in oilcloth. He slid the maps and cassette into his duffel, then paused over the journal. The last page he had read still lay open. For standing ground when men with clean hands tell him he has none. He closed the journal and tucked it under his coat. Duke stood, favoring the bandaged paw. Frank noticed and pointed at him. "Don't argue." Duke looked away, which was as close to arguing as he got. The old ladder groaned as Frank lowered himself through the hatch first. He helped Duke down carefully, lifting under the chest when the dog's injured paw slipped on a rung. Duke accepted the help with a quiet grunt, then immediately tried to move ahead. Frank caught his collar. Slow. They descended into the hallway, leaving the attic open behind them. The house below looked different now. The torn study, the footprints, the kicked dust, the cracked window upstairs. None of it felt mysterious anymore. It felt like a clock already ticking. Frank carried the metal box to the living room and set it on the table. He found the old wood stove, checked the flue, and built the smallest fire he could manage without sending too much smoke above the trees. Heat began to gather slowly, pushing back the damp cold. He fed Duke from the dented bowl and watched the dog eat lying down, his bandaged paw stretched in front of him. Only then did Frank sit at the table and look again at the cassette. For Frank, if they come at night. He turned it over in his hands. No player. He searched the living room shelves, then the study, moving through the intruder's mess until he found an old battery-powered cassette recorder in a drawer beneath a stack of weathered field guides. Walter had labeled the drawer radio/tape/batteries. The batteries inside the recorder were dead. Frank checked the shelf below. A plastic bag held spares, corroded at one end but not all. He cleaned the contacts with his knife, replaced 2 batteries, and pressed play. The machine hissed, clicked. Then Walter Miller's voice filled the room. Older than Frank remembered. Rougher. Closer. "Frank, if you're hearing this after dark, bolt the front door and don't sleep upstairs." Duke raised his head. Frank did not move. On the tape, Walter drew a breath. "If they come, they won't come talking first." A slow creak sounded from outside the cabin. Frank's eyes lifted from the recorder to the dark window. Duke rose to his feet despite the bandage. Beyond the glass, at the edge of the tree line, a small red light blinked once and vanished. Frank did not go to the window. He went away from it. One step back, then another. His hand closed around Duke's collar and pulled the old dog down with him beside the table. The stove threw a low orange light across the room, too warm, too visible. Frank reached over and closed the damper halfway. The flames dropped, shrinking into a dull glow behind the iron door. The cassette recorder kept hissing on the table. Walter's voice came through the static. "They will test the house first. Sound, light, movement. Don't answer noise with noise. Let the mountain talk louder than you do." Frank pressed stop. The room went quiet except for the wind worrying the logs. Duke stood stiff under Frank's hand. His injured paw hovered slightly above the floor, but his eyes were locked on the window. The bandage had already darkened where blood worked through the cloth. Frank looked at it once, then looked away. Not now. He took the metal document box from the table and slid it under the loose floorboard near the stove where he had noticed a gap earlier. Not deep enough to hide it forever. Deep enough to keep it out of sight if someone looked through the window. The cassette went into his coat pocket. The maps went flat under his shirt, against his ribs. Duke made a soft sound. Frank lowered himself to the floor and crawled toward the side wall, keeping below window height. The cabin's logs were cold against his shoulder. He reached the corner where the front room met the kitchen and eased one eye toward a narrow crack between curtain and frame. Nothing at first. Only trees, rain-dark trunks, fog lying low between them. Then the red light blinked again. Farther left this time. Not a flashlight for seeing. Too small, too controlled. A marker light, the kind a man used when he wanted to keep his eyes adjusted to the dark. Frank's mouth flattened. "Two," he whispered. Duke's ear twitched. There were always two, if you saw one. Frank scanned wider. He let his eyes relax, looking for shapes that did not belong. A vertical line too straight. A patch of black that stayed black when branches moved. A glint where no water should be. There. A shoulder behind a pine. Then another shape lower near the creek path. Two men at the tree line. Maybe three. Frank backed away and moved to the rear of the cabin. He knew better than to stare too long from one place. In Afghanistan, men died because they loved the same window twice. The back room had a narrow door swollen in its frame. Frank did not open it. He crouched beside it and listened through the wood. Wind. Water. A faint click. Duke's lips lifted. Frank touched 2 fingers to the dog's neck. Hold. Outside, a man's voice carried through the trees. Low. Too far to make out the words. Then a second voice answered, closer to the porch. They were not trying to break in yet. They were measuring him. Frank moved back to the table and pressed play on the recorder, turning the volume almost all the way down. Walter's voice returned, thin and old. If you have the papers, they'll want you outside. Fire, fear, or a familiar voice. Don't trust the familiar one most. Frank's eyes lifted. A familiar voice. The cabin seemed to grow smaller around him. Caleb. Frank's fingers tightened on the recorder until the plastic creaked. He thought of the boy at age 10, asleep in the hayloft after following Frank around all day. Thought of Caleb at 13, asking how to back a trailer. Thought of Caleb with mud on his knees and a sandwich in both hands, smiling because Anne had made pie. Then he saw him on the porch in clean boots. You signed the transfer. Duke bumped Frank's hand with his nose. Frank stopped the tape. He found an old kerosene lantern on the shelf, empty. A cracked enamel pot, 2 tin plates, a stack of newspapers from years before. He placed one plate on the far side of the kitchen, tied a string to it with shaking fingers, and ran the string back toward the living room behind the table leg. A poor man's noise trap. Then he took the fire poker from beside the stove and slid it under the couch, where his hand could reach it without lifting his head. No heroics, no charging into woods. The job was simple. Stay alive. Keep Duke alive. Keep the papers. Outside, the rain changed. It had been misting before. Now drops struck the roof harder, steady and cold. The sound covered smaller movements. That worked both ways. Frank turned to Duke and crouched. The bandage needed attention. If the dog had to move fast, the loose wrap would make him stumble. Frank tore another strip from his already ruined shirt and reinforced the paw, folding cloth under the pad, tying above the joint, checking that he could still slide one finger beneath it. Duke watched the door over Frank's shoulder. You listen to me, Frank whispered. No charging. Not unless I say. Duke's eyes did not change. Frank knew that look. It was the same look Duke had worn years ago after a mudslide outside Boise, when the search team had called off digging near a collapsed porch and Duke had refused to leave. He had scratched until his paws bled. 6 minutes later, they pulled a little girl out from under an air pocket between 2 beams. Duke obeyed commands, but only until someone needed saving. A hard knock struck the front door. Once, then silence. Frank lowered his head. Another knock. Mr. Miller? A man called from outside. Frank? Not Caleb. The voice was older, smooth, controlled. Raymond Cole. Frank had heard him twice over the phone, always polite, always careful to sound concerned about tax burdens and legal complications. the kind of voice that wore a suit even in the dark. "Frank, this is Raymond Cole. I know this has all been confusing. Caleb told me you might come up here." Duke's growl returned, deeper now. Frank stayed flat against the floor behind the table. Raymond continued from the porch. "Nobody wants trouble. You're cold. You're tired. You don't have to be alone out here. Open the door, and we can talk like reasonable men." Frank looked at the ceiling. Reasonable men did not stand in the rain at a hidden cabin after dark. Something moved behind the house. Frank pulled the string. The tin plate fell in the kitchen with a loud clatter. The porch went silent. A second later, a flashlight beam sliced through the kitchen window. Duke lunged halfway up. Frank caught him by the collar. "Hold," he breathed. The flashlight searched the kitchen, then vanished. Raymond's voice came again, less warm now. "Frank, don't make this harder." Frank crawled toward the side wall and looked through the lower crack. One man was no longer at the tree line. He was moving toward the back of the cabin, using the rain for cover. Frank could see only pieces of him between trunks. Dark jacket, cap low, one hand near his chest. Duke saw him too. The dog's body lowered. Frank felt the collar tighten in his grip. "No," he whispered. The back window shattered. Glass burst inward across the kitchen floor. At the same instant, something small and dark came through the broken frame and hit the boards with a dull roll. Not a grenade. Not here. Not likely. But Frank's body did not wait for logic. He grabbed Duke and threw both of them behind the stone base of the stove as the object popped with a blinding flash and a vicious crack of sound. The cabin vanished in white. Frank's ears filled with a high, ringing scream. His breath locked. His hands searched for a rifle, for blood, for a radio, for Ruiz, for anyone still answering. Duke tore free. Through the ringing, Frank saw the dog launch toward the broken kitchen window. "Duke!" The German shepherd hit the intruder as the man tried to climb through. There was a shout, a crash, a snarl that shook the room. Then one sharp shot split the night. Not loud like the movies. Flat. Close. Final. Duke yelped. Frank's body moved before the sound finished. He grabbed the fire poker, surged through the ringing white haze, and saw the intruder stumbling back through the broken window, one arm raised against Duke's teeth. Duke dropped to the kitchen floor. Frank did not chase. He slammed the butt of the poker against the window frame, driving the man backward into the rain. The intruder cursed and disappeared from view. Outside, Raymond shouted something Frank could not hear clearly. Frank fell to his knees beside Duke. The dog was breathing. Fast. Wet. The wound was high in the shoulder, blood dark against the black and tan fur. Duke tried to lift his head and failed. Frank pressed both hands over the wound. "Stay with me," he said. His voice broke on the last word, but his hands did not. The cabin shook under another gust of rain. At the tree line, red light blinked again, this time closer. Frank pressed harder against Duke's shoulder. The old dog's blood warmed his palms in the cold cabin. Duke's eyes stayed open, fixed on Frank's face, but his breathing had gone shallow and fast. Every few seconds, his ribs hitched like the air had to climb over something sharp. "Easy," Frank whispered. "Easy, boy." Outside, rain hammered the roof. A voice called from the porch, muffled by the storm. "Frank, this doesn't have to get worse." "Raymond Cole." Frank did not answer. He slid one hand under Duke's neck and the other over the wound, feeling for the pulse of blood. High shoulder. Through soft tissue, maybe. Not chest. Not if God had left him anything tonight. Pressure first. He grabbed the torn shirt he had used for Duke's paw and ripped the rest into strips with his teeth. His fingers moved on their own now. Fold cloth thick. Press, hold, wrap over shoulder, under chest, back across. Tight enough to slow bleeding, Not tight enough to choke movement. Pressure. Elevate if possible. Keep him warm. Words from another lifetime. Words shouted over rotors. Words written in dust and sweat and loss. Duke tried to rise. No. Frank pushed him down gently. You're not clearing anything now. The dog gave a low, angry breath. Frank almost laughed, but it came out broken. A board creaked near the back of the house. Frank's head snapped up. The flashbang had filled the kitchen with smoke and the sharp chemical stink of burned powder. Broken glass glittered under the window. Rain blew in through the shattered frame and carried with it the smell of wet earth and men outside. Frank dragged Duke away from the window, one arm under the dog's chest, the other around his hindquarters. Duke weighed less than he should have, but still enough to tear pain through Frank's back. He did not stop. He pulled him behind the stone base of the stove and laid him on the braided rug. The stove had gone almost dark. Good. Frank slipped the metal document box from under the floorboard and shoved it into the duffel with the maps. The box was too heavy, but leaving it was not an option. The papers were not money. They were the reason his father had built a house that breathed. The reason Caleb had smiled in the rain. The reason men stood outside at night pretending to be reasonable. A scrape came from the kitchen door. Then a whisper. Frank lowered himself flat and looked through the gap beneath the counter. A boot shadow moved outside the broken window, not coming in yet, waiting for him to run. Frank reached for the cassette recorder and pressed play with his thumb, holding it close to his ear. Walter's voice hissed through the tiny speaker. If they breach from the rear, use the cold cellar. Trapdoor under the pantry shelf. Don't take the stairs if you have blood on your hands. Blood shows where you went. Frank closed his eyes for half a second. Dad, he breathed. Duke stirred. Frank turned off the recorder and slid it into his coat. The pantry was beyond the kitchen, past the broken glass, past the window where they would be watching. He needed noise somewhere else. He grabbed the enamel pot from the floor and threw it toward the front room. It struck the far wall and bounced across the boards with a loud metal clatter. Outside, someone shouted, "Front!" A flashlight beam swept away from the kitchen. Frank moved. He pulled Duke across the floor, keeping low, dragging him on the rug to muffle the sound. The dog's breathing rasped in his ear. Frank's knees hit glass once, twice, but he kept going. At the pantry shelf, he shoved aside old jars and found the iron ring recessed in the floor. He pulled. The trapdoor lifted with a damp groan. Cold air rose from below. Duke raised his head and growled weakly toward the kitchen. "Not now," Frank whispered. "We're moving." A hard impact struck the front door. Once. Twice. Wood splintered. Frank lowered the duffel first, then climbed down into the dark cellar. His boots found packed dirt. The space smelled of stone, potatoes long gone, and old water. He reached up and pulled Duke down carefully, taking most of the dog's weight against his chest. Duke made one sound, small and sharp, and Frank froze with him halfway through the opening. "I know," Frank said against his fur. "I know." The front door crashed open above them. Frank lowered Duke the rest of the way and eased the trapdoor down until only a finger of light remained. Boots entered the cabin. 2 sets. Maybe 3. The men moved fast at first, then slower, searching. A flashlight beam cut through cracks in the floorboards overhead. "Kitchen's clear," one man called. "Find him," Raymond answered, "and find the box." Frank's hand closed around Duke's muzzle, not to silence him hard, only to remind him. The German shepherd trembled under his palm, not from fear, from the effort of staying still while strangers walked above his wounded body. Frank's eyes adjusted. The cellar extended farther than expected, a low tunnel walled with stacked stone. Not a storage room, a passage. Walter had written secondary path. The tunnel floor sloped downward. Frank slid the duffel strap across his chest, then lifted Duke again, as much as his arms allowed. He could not carry him all the way. Not at 68. Not with a bad back and knees that felt packed with gravel. So they moved like injured men have always moved, a few feet at a time. Frank pulled. Duke pushed with his good legs. They stopped when the dog's breathing went ragged. They moved when boots overhead shifted away. Halfway down the passage, thunder cracked above the ridge. Frank's chest locked. The tunnel became a culvert. The stone walls closed in. The smell of wet dirt became burned metal. A flare turned night into white dust. Ruiz was beside him again, hand reaching, eyes wide, one word on his mouth. Don't. Frank's hand slipped from Duke's harness. The dog collapsed against his leg. The weight brought him back. Not Ruiz. Duke. Not then. Now. Frank pressed his forehead briefly against the cold stone wall. Not again, he whispered. Duke's ear flicked at his voice. Frank tightened his grip and moved. Behind them, the trapdoor above the pantry groaned. Someone had found it. A flashlight beam stabbed into the cellar. Down here! Frank did not run. Running made noise. Running made mistakes. He reached into his pocket, found the old cassette recorder, pressed play, and threw it back up the tunnel toward the cellar entrance. Walter's voice suddenly filled the darkness behind them. If they come at night, make them think you stayed where they expected. The men above cursed. A shot cracked into the stone near the recorder. Sparks spat from rock. Frank dragged Duke around a bend just as the tunnel swallowed the light behind them. The passage narrowed, then widened again into a small chamber cut into the ridge. Frank nearly missed it in the dark. His hand struck a wooden table. Something metal clanged softly. He stopped. A faint green glow sat in the corner. Not a window. A radio dial. Frank stared. A bank of old equipment lined the wall. Dusty, but not dead. A hand-crank generator sat bolted to a shelf. Beside it, a field radio, coiled wire, spare batteries in sealed tins. A clipboard hung from a nail with frequencies written in Walter's hand. Forest Service, County Sheriff, Federal Land Office, Emergency Channel. Duke lowered himself to the stone floor with a shuddering breath. Frank stood over him, chest heaving, one hand still wet with the dog's blood. Behind them, men entered the tunnel. Ahead of them, Walter's old radio waited in the dark. Frank reached for the crank. The handle was stiff from years of sleep. Frank wrapped his blood-slick fingers around it and turned. The first rotation gave a dry scrape. The second caught. By the third, a low electric whine rose from the box bolted to the shelf. The radio dial brightened. Weak green light filled the stone chamber, touching Duke's gray muzzle, the old field table, the papers hanging from the wall in Walter's careful hand. Behind them, voices moved inside the tunnel. Light up ahead. Careful. He's cornered. Frank kept cranking. His shoulder burned. His ribs hurt from dragging Duke. His knees trembled under him, not enough to drop him, just enough to remind him the body had a ledger and every old debt was coming due tonight. The radio hissed. Frank grabbed the handset. Static. He checked the frequency sheet. Forest Service Emergency Channel first, then County Relay, then Land Office if the old repeater still existed. His thumb found the transmit button. Mayday, Mayday. This is Frank Miller at Walter Miller's Ridge House, Bitterroot Line, near County Access Road 9. Armed contact. One wounded canine. Property documents tied to federal land and water rights. Need sheriff, ranger, federal land office. Static answered. Frank cranked again. Duke lifted his head from the stone floor and gave a weak growl toward the tunnel. The men were closer. Frank keyed the handset again, voice shorter this time, clipped down to what mattered. Contact. 2 armed. 1 wounded K9. Fire risk. Need immediate response. Grid follows. He looked at Walter's clipboard. Beneath the frequency list was a line of coordinates written in pencil and circled twice. Frank read them slowly. A burst of static snapped through the speaker. Then a voice, faint and broken. Station calling from Ridge House. Repeat last grid. Frank closed his eyes for half a second. Someone was listening. He repeated the coordinates, slower, then added, 2 intruders in cellar tunnel. Civilian elder. No firearm. Dog down, but alive. The answer came through stronger. Ridge House, this is Clearwater Ranger Relay. Stay on channel. County dispatch notified. Do you have a safe exit? Frank looked around the chamber. Stone walls. 1 tunnel behind them. Shelves, old batteries. Coiled wire. A narrow black space behind the radio table where cold air moved low across the floor. He remembered Walter's tape. Use the cold cellar. Don't take the stairs. He scanned the floor and saw iron hinges half hidden beneath dust near the back wall. Maybe, he said into the handset. A hard crack echoed down the tunnel. Not a shot. Wood breaking. Then the smell reached them. Smoke. Frank's head turned toward the passage. At first, it was just a thread in the dark, then thicker. Chemical and wet pine. Someone had lit something near the pantry above, and the tunnel was beginning to draw it downward like a chimney. Raymond Cole's voice came from the darkness, no longer smooth. Frank, you hear me? You've got no reason to die in there. Send out the documents, and I'll make sure nobody presses charges. Frank stared at the radio. Nobody presses charges. A small laugh moved in his chest, dry and humorless. Duke tried to rise. His front legs slid on the stone. Frank crossed to him and pushed him gently down. Stay. This time Duke obeyed because he could not do much else. Frank keyed the radio. They've started a fire. The Ranger relay answered immediately. Ridge House, get low. Exit if possible. Units are mobilizing. Weather may slow approach. Can you identify suspects? Frank looked toward the tunnel. A beam of light appeared around the bend, then vanished. The men were waiting for smoke to do their work. One is attorney Raymond Cole, Frank said. Other unknown. Possible Caleb Miller involved in fraud transfer of Lower Farm. He did not let the name shake in his mouth. The chamber filled with more smoke. Duke coughed. Frank dropped the handset and went to the hinged panel at the rear of the chamber. He scraped dirt away with both hands until he found the pull ring. It took 2 tries. The ring was frozen with grit. On the third, it came loose. A trapdoor lifted from the stone floor. Cold air rushed up. Not stale, moving air. A crawl space sloped downward into darkness, barely wide enough for a man. Maybe enough for a man dragging a wounded dog if mercy still existed somewhere in the mountain. Frank went back to the radio. Clearwater, I have an auxiliary exit under radio room. Moving now. Keeping documents with me. Copy, Ridge House. Stay on channel if able. Frank looked at the handset, then at Duke, then at the duffel. He could not carry everything. Walter's papers mattered. Duke mattered more. Frank shoved the handset into the duffel, yanked the radio cord until it tore from the table, and took only the small battery pack and portable unit beneath it. The signal might hold, might not. That was a later problem. Smoke curled thicker through the chamber. Footsteps entered the tunnel behind them. Frank grabbed an old metal fire extinguisher from the wall, checked the gauge, and almost smiled when the needle sat barely in the green. Walter had kept everything ready. He pulled the pin, aimed into the tunnel mouth, and squeezed. White powder exploded into the passage. Men shouted. The flashlight beam vanished. Frank kept spraying until the extinguisher coughed empty, filling the tunnel with a choking cloud. Then he lifted Duke. The dog was too heavy, too hurt, too stubborn to be dead weight. Frank got both arms under him and dragged him to the trapdoor. "Down," he whispered. "Easy." Duke slid into the crawl space first with a low whine that cut straight through Frank's chest. Frank followed, pushing the duffel ahead, pulling the dog by the harness, keeping the bandage pressed when he could. Behind them, someone entered the chamber, coughing. "Back exit!" a man shouted. Frank kicked the trapdoor down as far as it would go. It did not close fully behind him, but it cut the light. The crawl space was black and tight. Cold water soaked Frank's sleeves. Rock scraped his shoulders. Smoke followed, thinner now, but still there. Duke's breathing rasped ahead of him. Frank pushed forward on elbows and knees. In his head, another tunnel tried to open. Not this one. A culvert in Afghanistan. No light. Radio dead. Men outside speaking a language he did not know. The taste of copper in his mouth. He stopped. Duke made a small sound ahead. Frank moved again. "Not again," he said, teeth clenched. "Not this time." The crawl space angled upward after 20 feet, then left. Cold air strengthened. Rain ticked somewhere ahead. Frank pushed the duffel through a curtain of roots and felt open space beyond. He crawled out under a shelf of rock behind the cabin. Rain slapped his face. Night air hit his lungs so hard he almost sobbed. He pulled Duke out after him and dragged him behind a fallen log. The cabin stood uphill through the trees, smoke leaking from the rear and front porch glowing orange where fire had begun to chew at old wood. Men moved near the house, shadows against smoke. Frank reached into the duffel and found the portable radio. Static. He keyed it. "Ridge house out. I'm outside. Northwest of structure. Dog alive." The reply was weak, but there. "Copy. Stay concealed. Help inbound." Then a new voice cut through the rain. Not Raymond. Younger. Familiar. Uncle Frank. Frank went still behind the log. Duke lifted his head, ears trembling forward. Caleb stepped out of the smoke near the side of the cabin, rain shining on his clean jacket, flashlight in one hand. "Uncle Frank!" he called again. "Just give me the box, and this stops." Frank's fingers closed around the duffel strap. There it was. The familiar voice Walter had warned him about. Frank stayed behind the fallen log with one arm over Duke's shoulders and the duffel pinned beneath his chest. Rain slid down the back of his neck, mud soaked through his knees. The smoke from the cabin rolled low through the trees, turning the flashlight beams into pale, broken columns. Caleb stood near the side porch, calling into the dark, like a man trying to sound worried for someone he had already betrayed. "Uncle Frank, listen to me. Raymond says this can still be fixed." Frank did not answer. Duke's body trembled under his hand. The wound in the dog's shoulder had slowed, but the bandage was dark and heavy. Every breath Duke took sounded like work. Frank kept his palm flat against the dog's ribs. Still moving. Still here. Caleb took a few steps away from the burning porch, scanning the ground with his flashlight. He was careful now. Not the boy from the hayloft. Not the young man who once begged Frank to let him drive the tractor. His boots moved through the wet leaves like he had been coached where to look and where not to stand. Raymond Cole emerged behind him through the smoke, one sleeve pulled across his mouth. "Keep your voice down," Raymond snapped. Caleb turned. "He's out here." "I know he is." "Then stop announcing where you are." The sharpness in Raymond's voice made Caleb flinch. Frank saw it. So Raymond was still the one holding the leash. A distant thump rolled over the ridge. Frank lifted his head a fraction. At first, he thought thunder. Then it came again, steadier, chopping through the rain from far away. Rotor blades. Not close, but real. Caleb heard it too. His face changed in the flashlight glow. Raymond grabbed his arm. What did he do? Caleb shook his head. I don't know. He had a radio, you idiot. Frank shifted the duffel strap under his elbow and slowly rose behind the log. Not fully. Just enough. He could stay hidden and wait. But Raymond was moving now, eyes sharp, and the fire at the cabin was spreading along the porch rail. If wind shifted, the whole safe house could go. Walter's journals, the radio room, the hidden compartments, all the proof of what this place had been before greedy men found it useful. Frank looked down at Duke. The dog tried to stand when Frank moved. No, Frank whispered. Duke ignored him. One front paw, then the other. His wounded shoulder dipped, but he stayed upright, pressed against Frank's leg. Frank swallowed once. Stubborn old fool. Duke's ear twitched. Frank stepped out from behind the log with both hands raised. Caleb. The flashlight snapped toward him. Caleb's face went pale. Raymond turned slower, but his eyes went straight to the duffel. Frank stood in the rain, mud to his shins, shirt torn, gray hair plastered to his forehead. Duke stood beside him, swaying but silent. Caleb's voice cracked. You should have just stayed gone. Frank looked at him for a long second. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself. Caleb's jaw tightened. You don't understand what this is worth. I understand what it cost. Raymond stepped forward, one hand open. Frank, there is no need for melodrama. You're injured. Your dog is injured. The cabin is burning. Give me the documents, and we'll get you both help. The helicopter sound grew a little louder, then softened behind the ridge. Frank did not look toward it. Help like the tax papers? He said. Help like the transfer Caleb put in front of me? Caleb looked away. Raymond's face hardened. That property was drowning you. You were months from losing everything anyway. Frank nodded toward the burning porch. So you came up here at night out of charity? Raymond's eyes moved again to the duffel. There it was. The hunger Walter had written about. Clean hands, polite words. A man who would burn down a shelter and still call himself practical. Caleb stepped between them. Uncle Frank, please, just hand it over. We can settle this. You don't need the whole mountain. You don't need the water rights. You're one old man living in a truck. The words sat in the rain. Frank felt them, but they did not land where Caleb wanted. He thought of the overpass, the cold seat, Duke's head on his knee, Walter's note, Anne's empty chair, the farm gate closing behind him. Then he thought of the maps, the old emergency shelter records, the families Walter had carried through storms, the skiers he had warmed by the stove, the county roads washed out, the spring under the ridge that could keep a valley alive when summer turned hard. Frank lowered his hands slowly. I was one old man, he said, until you followed me here. Raymond's mouth tightened. The helicopter thumped louder now. A second sound joined it. Engines. Far below, faint but rising along the old road. Raymond heard them. He moved fast. Not toward Frank. Toward the duffel. Frank stepped back, putting his body between Raymond and Duke. Caleb reached out as if to stop the lawyer, but Raymond shoved him hard enough to send him stumbling into the mud. You fool, Raymond hissed. You brought them right to us. Frank saw Raymond's hand go for the strap. Duke moved first, wounded, limping, half out of strength. The old German shepherd launched from Frank's side with a sound that was more breath than bark. He hit Raymond low, shoulder to thigh, teeth clamping onto the sleeve of the hand reaching for the bag. Raymond screamed and twisted backward. Frank lunged, grabbed the duffel, and fell with it, turning his body so Duke did not take the impact. Caleb shouted, "Stop! Stop!" Raymond kicked, trying to wrench free. Duke held on, paws slipping in the mud, blood soaking through his bandage again. Frank wrapped one arm around Duke's chest and pulled him back before Raymond could strike him a second time. The woods exploded with light. White beams cut through smoke and rain from 3 directions. A loudspeaker cracked through the trees. "Sheriff's office! Hands where we can see them!" Raymond froze. Caleb dropped to his knees, hands raised, face empty with shock. Frank stayed in the mud with Duke against him and the duffel under his arm. Men in rain jackets and tactical vests moved through the trees. Behind them came a Forest Service truck, then another, engines growling along the old access path Walter had marked decades ago. The helicopter circled above the clearing, its searchlight sliding across the burning cabin. The broken window, the torn ground, the faces of men caught between greed and dawn. A ranger knelt beside Frank. "Sir, are you hit?" Frank shook his head. "The dog," he said. The ranger looked down. Duke's head rested against Frank's arm. His eyes were half closed, but when the ranger touched the bandage, his lip lifted faintly. Frank put a hand over Duke's muzzle. "Easy. He's friendly." The ranger glanced at the torn sleeve in Raymond's hand and raised one eyebrow. Frank looked at Duke. "He's selective." Another deputy pulled Raymond upright. Raymond began talking at once, fast and polished, about misunderstandings and trespassing, and an unstable old man. Nobody seemed to be listening. Caleb stayed on his knees in the mud. Frank looked at him. For the first time since the farm gate, Caleb looked young, not innocent, just young. "Uncle Frank," he said. Frank turned his face away. The sky above the ridge had begun to lighten. Dawn came gray and cold through the rain. The fire on the porch hissed as rangers dragged hoses from the truck and beat back the flames before they reached the roof. A woman in a dark federal field jacket approached with a hard case in one hand. "Mr. Miller?" she said. "I'm Laura Bennett with the Federal Land Office. We received the relay. Do you have the documents?" Frank looked down at the duffel. His hands did not want to let go. Duke shifted slightly against him, then gave one tired breath. Frank opened the bag. The metal box was wet, muddy, and still sealed. Laura Bennett took it like it weighed more than metal. An hour later, as medics wrapped Duke for transport and the rain softened into mist, Bennett returned to Frank beside the ambulance. Her expression had changed. Not excitement. Not pity. Recognition. "These records don't just protect your land," she said quietly. "They show an unpermitted drilling plan tied to a protected aquifer. If that project had gone through, the lower valley could have lost its emergency water reserve." Frank looked past her toward the cabin, smoke rising from the blackened porch boards. Walter's safe house had not only been hiding evidence, it had been guarding the valley. Duke lifted his head weakly from the blanket. Frank leaned close, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "You hear that?" he whispered. "You found it, partner." Duke's tail moved once beneath the blanket. Small. Enough. Winter came early to the ridge that year. By the time the first real snow settled over the Bitterroot line, the burned boards on Walter Miller's porch had been replaced with fresh cedar. The cracked window upstairs, Samus had new glass. The hidden attic panel still opened if you knew where to press, but Frank had left the ladder in place now. Secrets had done their job. Shelter mattered more. Duke came home from the animal hospital with a shaved patch on his shoulder, a line of stitches, and a limp he pretended not to have. The vet in Missoula said, "He needs rest." Duke heard that and immediately tried to climb into Frank's truck by himself. Frank caught him under the ribs before he slipped. "Rest," Frank said, lifting him carefully. "That means you let me do the work for once." Duke looked out the windshield and ignored him. The legal work took months. Frank learned that justice did not come like lightning. It came like fence repair. One post at a time, one document, one signature, one sworn statement. One long afternoon in a county office smelling of old paper and bad coffee. Raymond Cole was indicted on fraud, coercion, and conspiracy charges connected to the illegal transfer of Miller land and the attempted destruction of protected water rights records. Bitterroot Extraction Group disappeared from its rented office before Christmas, but Laura Bennett and the federal investigators found enough paper trails to make the name matter in court. Caleb took a plea. Frank heard it from a lawyer in a Navy suit who spoke softly, as if volume could change the shape of betrayal. Caleb admitted he had been paid to pressure Frank into signing the transfer. He claimed he did not know Raymond planned violence at the safe house. He claimed he thought Frank would simply leave. Frank listened without moving. Duke lay under the conference table with his bandaged shoulder pressed against Frank's boot. When the lawyer finished, Frank asked only one question. Did he know what the papers were for? The lawyer hesitated. Yes. Frank nodded once. That was all. Outside the courthouse, Caleb waited by the steps. He looked thinner than he had on the porch that night. His clean confidence worn down into something gray and restless. He held his cap in both hands. "Uncle Frank," he said. Frank stopped, but he did not step closer. Duke stood between them, quiet as a fence line. Caleb's eyes dropped to the dog, then back to Frank. "I didn't think it would go that far." Frank looked at the courthouse doors behind him, then at the wet street, then at Caleb. That's what men say when they let someone else carry their conscience. Caleb swallowed. "I'm sorry." Frank had waited months to hear those words. When they came, they did not repair anything. They just lay there in the cold air, small and late. Frank put one hand on Duke's head. "I hope someday you are," he said. Then he walked away. He did not move back to the old Idaho farmhouse. The courts returned the land. The deed was corrected. The transfer was voided. The farm was his again on paper. But paper could not take the smell of Caleb's hands off the front gate. Frank drove there once in late November, stood by the barn for 10 minutes, and listened to the wind move through the empty hayloft. Duke sniffed the porch steps, then looked back toward the truck. Frank understood. Some places survived. Some places did not. They returned to the ridge. The safe house had scars now. The porch rail was new wood against old logs. Smoke had darkened the stones near the stove. The kitchen window still carried a faint notch where broken glass had cut the sill. Frank did not sand that mark away. He spent the winter fixing what he could. A ranger crew helped repair the roof before the heavy snow. A retired electrician from Missoula got the radio room cleaned and wired to a solar battery. Laura Bennett sent copies of the water records and had the originals stored where men like Raymond Cole could not reach them with fire or charm. Neighbors came too, though Frank had not asked. An old rancher named Bill Harlan brought a load of split tamarack and said his mother had once spent a night in that house during the storm of '78. A woman from the lower valley left jars of peaches and did not stay long enough to be thanked. 2 young veterans from the county outreach office drove up with cots, blankets, and a coffee maker that looked too fancy for the place. Frank tried to refuse the coffee maker. Duke sat beside it. The young veteran grinned. "Dog outranks you, sir." Frank kept it. By January, the first stranded man arrived just before midnight. He was a former Marine, 30 maybe, with a cracked phone, a dead car, and the kind of eyes Frank knew better than he wanted to. He had been trying to reach Spokane, got lost on the back road, and nearly walked into a whiteout wearing city shoes. Duke heard him before the knock. The old dog rose from his rug by the stove, limped to the door, and gave one bark. Frank opened it with a blanket in his hands. The young man stood on the porch with snow crusted on his eyebrows, trying hard not to shake. "Sir," he said, "I saw the light." Frank stepped aside. "Then you came the right way." The man looked at Duke. "He friendly?" Frank glanced down. Duke sniffed the man's sleeve, then leaned his shoulder lightly against his leg. "He's selective," Frank said. The man slept 14 hours. After that, word moved quietly through the valley. Not fast, not loud, but steady. A place on the ridge. Stove always lit in winter. Radio working. Cots in the back room. Coffee if Frank remembered to make it. Dog at the door. Frank did not call it charity. He called it keeping the house useful. Spring came slow. Snow pulled back from the creek in silver threads. The pines shed their heavy white loads. The ridge turned from iron to green. Duke's limp stayed, but his eyes sharpened again, especially when trucks came up the road. One clear morning, Frank climbed to the attic alone. Sunlight came through the new glass and laid warm rectangles across the floorboards. The blood stain near the old footlocker remained, darker than the wood around it. Frank had learned from Walter's journal that the stain belonged to a rescue volunteer who cut his arm badly during a storm years before Frank was born. The man had lived. Walter had brought him down the mountain at dawn. Not every stain meant failure. Frank opened the hidden wall one last time. The cavity was empty now except for the leather journal. Frank placed a copy of the shelter charter beside it, wrapped in fresh oilcloth. Walter's Safe House Emergency Winter Shelter. Open to stranded travelers, veterans, search teams, and any soul caught between storms. Frank closed the panel gently. Downstairs, hammering sounded from the porch. Bill Harlan was hanging the sign while two younger men held the ladder. Duke sat in the yard supervising with grave authority, his tail sweeping once every time someone looked at him. Frank stepped outside. The new sign was made from cedar, burned dark around the letters. Walter's Safe House. No veteran sleeps outside. Bill climbed down and squinted at it. "Looks straight to me." "It's crooked," Frank said. Bill looked again. "Maybe a hair." Duke barked once. Frank smiled. "Dog says leave it." So they did. That evening, after everyone drove back down the mountain, Frank sat on the porch with Duke at his feet. The sky over the Bitterroot Range turned copper, then blue, then deep black. Smoke rose from the chimney in a clean line. Inside, the radio hummed softly. The coffee maker clicked off. Two folded blankets waited near the stove for whoever might need them next. A gust of wind moved under the eaves and slipped through the upper wall. For years, a sound like that would have taken Frank somewhere else. Back to roads that exploded. Back to voices he could not save. Back to nights under bridges, counting breaths until morning. But this time, the wind moved through the attic and down through the old house like a long, steady exhale. Duke lifted his head. Frank rested a hand between the dog's ears. "I hear it," he said. The house was breathing, not like a warning, like it was alive. And maybe that's what made this story special. Not the hidden documents, not the land, not even the fortune that powerful people thought they could take. It was a tired old veteran and a loyal dog who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. If you believe Duke was the true hero of this story, comment one below. If you think Frank's father, Walter, was still protecting his son all those years later, comment 0. And if this story meant something to you, let us know where you're watching from. I read as many comments as I can, and I love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more unbelievable than this one. Until then, take care of the people who stand by you, and never underestimate the loyalty of a good dog. We'll see you in the next story.